come to me.
Open the door, Sue, come on.
Look at this. Best part. You can eat them. Who are these people? What is this? Why don't you ask your mommy?
Mommy's with the maggots now.
Devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Well, greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, after a very long absence. Now, this has been due to physical ailments, from breaking my arm and to eventually having to have spinal surgery. And I'm not out of the woods yet. I have one more arm operation to go. If you want the whole bloody story, there should be a link either here or at the end of this that links you to my other channel where I spend an hour talking about it. So if you're interested in whatever happened to Burn, that's the place to go. Meanwhile, culture goes on without me, or rather, I'm viewing it from a very weird position because I haven't made a video for over 6 months. Not a real video. And I've been watching things from like a periscope in my bed. I spent so much of the last since mid-March on my back, recovering from this spine surgery. I am now off my back. Things are still very tight with my spine. My walking is strange because they did some odd things to my nerves, which will eventually go away. My arm, meanwhile, needs another operation. And you know what? All of that facing of pain is a bit horrific, to say the least. I mean, I went through pains here. I describe it more in the other channel that were off my scale entirely. As I said, breaking my arm was a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. Some of the other pains I felt were like a 12, really that bad. Meanwhile, out in the big world, one thing I've noticed is that I was right. I made a video, I made one in 2025. I probably made a different kind of one in 2024. But that horror has become the dominant genre in 2026. And as I think it's Thomas Flight has a channel, he says it's the only genre left. Because when you think about it, Where are the great comedies? Where are the war films? Where are the action films? Where are the adventure films? Where are the romance films? Where are the romantic comedies? Where are the dramas? They're all, they've been put onto the internet, and there's mixed in with an awful lot of crap. And the only genre that continues, and in fact gets better and better, is horror. This is not an accident. This is something I've been seeing for a while. And I'm going to give you a little bit of my history of understanding the horror genre here. And why, ever since I first began to look at it, I said, this is one of the most important genres. I think science fiction continues, although these days science fiction and horror often get blended together. We have a movie coming up called Soul Mate, with the 8 part being the letter 8. And it's another film like Megan, Fear of AI. That's sci-fi, but it's also deals with the other subject that we'll mention in a moment. And of course, one of the things that happened was only about 3 weeks ago was I able to go travel to a movie theater by myself. I had been watching DVDs. I've been watching YouTube videos, but you can only watch YouTube for so long before your brain just leaks out. Unfortunately, that was my main thing, because I couldn't even turn the DVD player on. I had a Georgian nurse, an old woman, who literally I could not tell. I couldn't give any instructions to, because she just didn't get it. What's this whole technology thing, basically? But some of the things I noticed was what happened with some films coming from YouTubers who made films like Obsession and Backrooms in particular. And I think anyone dealing with films these years, you're going to get to these two films and you're going to go, what was this about? And that's what I'm going to discuss, is what this is about. Because it's not an accident. It's not, oh, how did we get here? We got here because, for one thing, between the diversity, equity, and inclusion dogma, so many old traditional types of movies were just scooped out of any real content, and instead was stuffed with these new ideas, which after a while, some of them are okay, but after a while, it's just, stop preaching to us. We don't want to be preached to. We want to see stories, and stories are really important, and stories are what they killed. The same thing happened 10 years ago. Marvel movies were building towards their Avengers climax with Thanatos and all of this, and Thanos, they both mean death, and they were moving towards their climax, and everyone was hooked on them. Although this other stuff was bubbling underway, the DEI stuff. But after their big conclusion in 2019, bang! There have hardly been any good Marvel movies since then. There have been a few. Spider-Man has been consistent, and there's a new Spider-Man movie. It's out in America. I think we have another week before we get it here. I'm interested in seeing it. Why did Spider-Man become such an interesting figure, whereas Superman, whose movie came out last year, it was kind of like, people saw it, it made a little bit of money, but it wasn't the blockbuster they were hoping for. And in fact, most comic book movies, they put out a Supergirl movie each year, and I told someone this the other day, and they said, really? Which is the answer. Nobody even knew it came and went. Because it doesn't matter anymore. Superheroes don't matter the way they did. Because they'd been exploited to death and then stuffed with the DEI message. And essentially, those two things killed it. Too many of them, we often hear stories of them going into a huge production, and they don't even know what the story is yet. They're still working on the screenplay. This is insanity. But anyway, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about the Disney foibles. We're not talking about all the things happening in the world of streaming, which we could discuss. Many of these things I discussed in my earlier videos on the subject. But what we're discussing here today is why horror is the dominant, perhaps the only real genre left. Horror is still the only one that people will show up at a movie theater and go, what's playing here? Oh, there's a horror film. Let's go see that. And you don't need to know who's in it. You don't need to know what it's about. If someone will say, oh, I heard some good things about it, that's all you need. And even then, people will go to bad horror films. Although, there have been so many good ones, we've been spoiled for choice. So, here's my history of understanding horror films. When I was a kid, I subscribed to Famous Monsters of Filmland until I got an issue which had on its cover this witch figure, a painting of the witch figure. Was it by Norman Saunders? It may have been. Or one of those great illustrators at the time. Of this witch figure from the movie... what is it? It has different names. Horror Hotel was one of them. And it was just such a horrific face. It really chilled me. For some reason, seeing a disfigured version of a woman, this also happened in the Creepy, first edition of Creepy, which I now own, because I wanted to understand why was this frightening to me. And I think many horror folks can point to a similar experience where some horror imagery in a movie really rattled them and gave them nightmares or something, and then they went back to it later because there's something about it that lures you in. Now, before we get into this, in the 1970s, I started to go to movies again. I had become a Christian in 1970 at the age of 15. And it was through the Jesus People movement. Now, we didn't have any policy about whether you should go to movies or not, but we just basically didn't. So I went through many years where, if you go from 1970 till about 1977, we'll put it roughly at Star Wars, where I probably saw, 4 or 5 movies in a movie theater in that whole period, which is highly unusual. I was watching more before then. But I started having experiences. I've explained in somewhere else my experience going to the movie Taxi Driver, which really put the bug into me to understand what's going on with movies. And Taxi Driver, although it's not exclusively a horror film, can be seen as a horror film. It can be seen as a psycho killer film, if you want to. Of course, there are horror purists out there who go, that's not horror. They love to do that. And this is something I don't remember until the 21st century. The people gatekeepers who are always saying, that's not horror, and that's not. So, Jaws, that's not horror, that's a shark film. Big monster like King Kong or Godzilla, that's not horror, that's a kaiju film. And I just want to slap these people and just say, oh, give me a break. We all know. It's a monster movie. What's a monster movie? A horror film. And maybe these older films are not up to contemporary standards of blood and gore, but they were horrific at the time. And I still see them that way. So in the late 70s, when I think it was a combination of things like Star Wars, Taxi Driver, I started going to a few newer movies. And I wanted to understand them. So I started subscribing at some point to Film Comment, which for many, many years was a great magazine. I finally had to stop subscribing. Conveniently, when the pandemic came, I just said, that's it. I'm going to cut my subscription off then, because they stopped doing physical copies at that point, and they'd just become too SJW, social justice warrior, too much critical theory and such. And there were other magazines like Film Quarterly that did that, but now it had invaded that. I think there was a guy, Gavin Smith, who was the editor for a long time, and he kept that stuff at bay, but eventually when he left, the new thing came in, and it's really started to, it was, I often distinguish between the film geek, which is a more modern formulation of a film maven, and people like myself who are much more a product of the 1970s when it came to horror films. So seeing foreign films, seeing horror films, seeing exploitation films, seeing, all these great new Hollywood films, which were often very dark, seeing war films, seeing all the different genre films. Whereas the film geek is much more, they'll be saying, did you see this new film by this guy in Thailand? Or this new film by this guy in, Iran or something. Not that those are bad films, but they get this cred from being in on all the more obscure sections and corners of filmdom. And I've never really felt that way. I have my own areas where I can probably out-geek most people. Like, talk to me about silent films or primitive cinema, which is the films, we'll just say roughly before about 1915. Or talk to me about puppet films, or talk to me about, even films from the 1930s, like screwball comedies and stuff. I have a lot of knowledge about these things. But I don't, silent films I love. I don't go out of my way to say to everyone, oh, you should see this, and you should see that, and you should see this. To me, if it comes up in a conversation, fine. Meanwhile, I will be pursuing what I want to pursue. Anyway, in the late 70s, it was in 1978, the July-August issue of Film Comment. Buddy Holly is on the cover. Actually, it's not Buddy Holly. It's Gary Busey playing Buddy Holly in the biopic that came out. I think that'll be the day. And Robin Wood was this gay, Marxist, Freudian, yes indeed, film critic. Now, if you know me, you know I probably didn't agree with him on most of those things. But that's not the point. The point was, he came out with an article called Return of the Repressed. And he took this Freudian concept that the thing that is repressed will come back. And there's a lot to be said about that. If you squash something long enough, it comes back. Now, the way Robin Wood was interpreting it was all in terms of sexuality. It was, so homosexuality, sadomasochism, all of these things were repressed. And there's certainly a case to be made that the Victorian era was just the height of repression. And then the 1950s was like a mini Victorian era when it came to repression of ideas and imagery and such like that. But he said some things that really sparked my curiosity. He said, what is repressed is never, of course, annihilated. It will always strive to return in disguised forms, in dreams, or as neurotic symptoms. If Freud was correct, and I see no reason to suppose otherwise, I would challenge him on this, we should expect to find the traces of repressed homosexuality in every film, just as we should expect to find them in every person, usually lurking beneath the surface, occasionally rupturing it, informing in various ways the human relationships depicted. And that's Robin Wood from his article on Return of the Repressed. That actually wasn't a comment from that specific issue, but he said the same kinds of things there. So, now, of course, I'm sitting there going, like, every film, every person, really? Well, you can look at it from a Freudian point of view and see and this was what was happening during the 70s. Every act of male hugging was really repressed homoerotic desire, etc., etc. Sorry, I don't go along with that at all. However, I do believe there is something to the theory that the repressed comes back. Now, he also connects this to a whole theory. The whole notion of Return of the Repressed is all about horror films. And it got me thinking about them, and I had heard people talking about things like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and such. And he completely spoils the whole plot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in there. And that made me want to go see it immediately. And trust me, whatever he said about it when I saw the actual movie was just like, didn't matter. It just didn't matter because it was such an intense experience. But when I walked out of that showing, it was at, the Palace Theater? No, the Plaza Theater in Petaluma, California, which was an old theater from the 1920s and 30s, which had been gone to see it. Eventually, when I first was seen it in Petaluma, it was a porno theater, and then they turned it into a repertory theater. And so they had the best programs. Whoever was programming that thing had the best taste for a programmer for movies. And so I saw so many things. I saw King Kong as a full-blown, how tall would that be? 25 feet? 30 feet? We'll say 10 meters high. Oh, that changed the film entirely. I'd always seen it on television, but seeing King Kong much bigger than me, even though it's obviously a puppet show, was just a revelatory experience. Likewise, I just saw so many great movies there, so I'm not going to go into that. But when I walked out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that night, with his article in my head and the experience of the movie, I said, whoa, I don't think he's right. This is not about repressed homosexual desire or anything like this. Although he pointed out it was interesting that the people in these full audiences would cheer Leatherface, the main killer with the chainsaw, every time he'd get somebody. And what was funny is he'd look at the audience and they all look exactly like the people in the movie theater on the screen. And he said essentially they're cheering for their own death. But I did believe horror films were talking about much more than we thought they were. And that began a process of really beginning to examine film. So, from that point on, even through my journeys, I lived for a year in Switzerland and France in 78, 79. I went to, I live in New York, then I went and lived in Alaska. And through all this period, I continued my film comment subscription because it was really, I thought, a valuable resource. Like I say, now, it doesn't matter so much to me because I have other sources. Many of those sources are on YouTube, and I can get some very interesting thoughts from commentators on YouTube. Also, one of the things I thought to myself, okay, he's talking about the return of the repressed. Well, we're living in a time now when homosexuality is not being repressed. I mean, there may be some individuals who are afraid they're gay or something, but you can find almost any sexual image on Earth within a few minutes of clicking away on your device. So all the sexuality is not being squashed. So what's being squashed? Well, we all know what's being squashed. It's extreme right-wing, the stuff that created World War II, the fascism, the Nazism. That's what's being repressed. And the problem is, he didn't see that. He saw horror films as basically, although he said there were some films that didn't concur with his thesis, but that basically were instruments of revolution to overturn, and of course since he was Marxist, it was always capitalism and stuff like this, whereas the horror film hasn't got an object that obvious. I mean, sometimes, maybe, yeah, but, it can also overturn Marxism. It can overturn Freud. It can overturn anybody you've got, because that's a horror film. Horror film makes you question, which is one of the reasons I love it. I love asking questions, and horror films, when I walk out, my head is buzzing with ideas. It's hard to do that coming out of a Marvel movie, which is basically a popcorn film, except for a few, like Logan was a pretty good film. But he sees it as an instrument of revolution. If we go over to Stephen King, who these days is seen as being more of as a cantankerous boomer. And he was more conservative back in those days. And nowadays he sticks to these kind of like low information boomer left-wing thoughts. But during these times he was really good. And in his introduction, in the foreword to his short story collection Night Shift, he says some of the following things. He says, "Fear makes us blind, and we touch each fear with all the avid curiosity of self-interest, trying to make a whole out of 100 parts, like the blind men with their elephant. We sense the shape. Children grasp it easily, forget it, and then relearn it as adults. The shape is there, and most of us come to realize what it is sooner or later. It is the shape of a body under the sheet. All our fears add up to one great fear. All our fears are part of that great fear. An arm, a leg, a finger, an ear. We're afraid of the body under the sheet. It's our body, and the great appeal of horror fiction throughout the ages is that it serves as a rehearsal for our own deaths." Now, he wrote this, I think it was 1981 or 82, after the 70s, which was a great epoch for horror films. Some people will say it's the 80s. I would say the 80s, it's a lot more cheesy fun, whereas the 70s was pretty much in earnest. I mean, if you compare something like Nightmare on Elm Street to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you get the difference really quickly. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is playing for keeps, and it still frightens people. Whereas Nightmare on Elm Street, very great movie, but it's a roller coaster ride. Whereas Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a roller coaster ride with half the roller coaster damaged. And you're really in fear. Later, Stephen King wrote in his book Danse Macabre, he wrote, "We fall from womb to tomb, from one blackness towards another, remembering little of one and knowing nothing of the other, except through faith." So he's saying we don't know anything about where we came from and nothing about where we're going unless you have faith. Here is the final truth of horror movies. They do not love death, as some have suggested. They love life. They do not celebrate deformity, but by dwelling on deformity, they sing of health and energy. By showing us the miseries of the damned, they help us to rediscover the smaller but never petty joys of our life. They are the barber's leeches of the psyche, drawing not bad blood, but bad anxiety for a little while. Anyway, typical Stephen King, kind of like throwing a few goosebumps at the end. So, in Stephen King's mind, actually, and if you read his writings in Danse Macabre, which is his book on horror films, that one's from 81, 82. I think Night Shift is from more like, the intro is more like 79 or so, which, like I said, relates to the horror films of the 70s. Essentially, he's saying they're more of a conservative power. So Robin Wood is saying they're revolutionary, but Stephen King says, no, they remind us of what is good. Remind us of what needs to be saved, essentially. They confront us with death, and then we have to try to make sense out of it. And a good horror film will really upset you. A really good horror film will really upset you, and then draw you back later to watch and go like, why did that do that to me? So one of the things I've learned is that horror films really do reflect society. And they reflect the eras we are in. So before we get to our present era, let me just give you a quick bullet points kind of view of some of the different eras. In the 1920s, German horror films, German silent horror films, are among the greatest works of film ever. Nosferatu, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, what was it? The Schatten, Warning Shadows, and there are others. These are great films. Also in America, films were being made by Lon Chaney, with people like Todd Browning, great director, who people don't think about him much anymore, but very familiar with the carnival world. So this was in the silent era. So essentially you had these two strains. One, this European darkness, and there were other European horror films. And then there was this kind of carny deformity show, which is what, in a sense, the American films were more like a sideshow, where you can come in and see the three-headed man kind of thing, although they never had a three-headed man. But all of Lon Chaney's stuff can be seen as this carnival sideshow attraction. Then came the 1930s. And in the 1930s, you had sound in film for the first time. But then the Universal Pictures monsters, Universal monsters, were very specific kind of things. I think they made over 50 different films that went into the 40s. But the first ones were, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and many others are all excellent films. The original ones. And then later they kind of go into what someone called the stock car rally of, the House of Frankenstein. And you got see the werewolf, see the Frankenstein, see the hunchback, all these kind of things. But the interesting thing about these is these films were all set in Europe. They were all part of Gothic, the Gothic tradition. Not the American Gothic tradition, which I've discussed in other places, but of that European thing of castles and monsters and dark rooms and, old churches and stuff like this. And in other words, America located its horror over in Europe, which is kind of fascinating considering what was happening in Europe at the time and how Europe was about to become a charnel house, particularly the further east you went. So then in the 1940s, during World War II, was the period of the least amount of horror films that were ever made in American culture. And there were some very good ones. There were still a few good Universal movies like The Werewolf, or rather The Wolfman. Interestingly enough, they also made Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was actually pretty good on horror and comedy. But that tells you something. There were several of these Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, etc. And so the Universal films were in decline. What wasn't was there was a producer over at RKO Pictures, Val Lewton, a Russian originally, who produced with different directors like Jacques Tourneur and some of the others, that Mark Robson, produced these absolutely astoundingly moody films. The Catwoman, The Seventh Victim, and others. These are some of my favorite horror films ever. They are all mood. They are not stated as horror. They are stated as dark, creepy mood.
One night a man came in, tiptoeing in. I had a scissors in my hand. I struck at him. I ran away. He was lying in the hole. Blood around him.
Your sister, Mary, is a murderess.
I don't believe it.
You go back to school and forget Jocelyn.
Drink it, Jacqueline. There's nothing else for you to do. The day you've got to die.
This whole technique, which is actually coming from Europe, and it went through the Universal monsters, now is in this, will eventually go to film noir, which can be seen as a kind of an American Gothic tradition. But we're not going to talk about that. But basically, there were very few horror films made compared to the 1930s in the 1940s. Then you come to the 1950s. And suddenly it's all science fiction, but you started to get the bug-eyed monsters, the giant ants, the giant claw.
A bird as big as a battleship, circling and preparing to attack the CAB plane.
Sorry, it's just one of the funkiest films ever made. Big monsters, Gojira, Godzilla. You started to get all these things, which were connected in many ways to science fiction. But by the end of the decade, a couple of things that happened. One, you started to get films like I Was a Teenage Werewolf. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein. Then you got things like, the first Hammer films, which were essentially the British treatment of all of those old, royalty-free products, Frankenstein, Dracula, Mummy, all the Wolfman, all the rest of it, done in England with more sumptuous-looking sets in color, with more blood and more cleavage. And so they came up with this idea, and some of them are pretty cheesy, and some of them are pretty frightening. But these went from the late 50s into the mid-70s, and then kind of petered off because the real show had started. Now, you notice one thing I do is I don't talk about the 50s and the 60s, because I think these are arbitrary. And you really have to see. So, for instance, the 50s era ends not in the 50s, but in the early decades of the 60s. It took certain things to happen. One of those things to happen was the movie Psycho. In fact, 1960 is an absolutely astounding year. Some of the greatest movies were made. Horror Hotel. I'm forgetting the other name of it, but if I was to look it up for a second, but it's a movie about witchcraft and stuff with Christopher Lee. Psycho came out. Peeping Tom, which rivals Psycho for psychological disturbance. Eyes Without a Face, my personal favorite horror film of all time. And there were others. 1960 is an absolutely amazing year for horror. But those films came out and they were like a blip, and it took a while for what they said. It always takes a while in cinema. So, for instance, the 60s in cinema doesn't happen. Basically, it starts in 69. Whereas the music is much earlier, because it's much easier to walk into a studio, play a song, make a record, and sell it, than it is to walk into a movie studio, get money, develop a product, get it into the screens. So making movies is generally 2 years behind what the music was doing, at least during that period. So by the late 60s, you start to have something new developing. There are films that came out during that period. They were searching. There's some very interesting early 70s films. I just watched Messiah of Evil the other day, which is this almost early precursor to liminal horror, which I'll discuss in a moment. It's not about the devil or anything. It's really a strange film. And then there's Let's Scare Jessica to Death. Earlier than that, in the early 60s, you had Carnival of Souls, which is very much a liminal horror film, although not in the kind of dead environments that we now have liminal horror films in. But by 68, you had the movie which came out, which changed everything. And that was Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero's great masterpiece, which took a while to take hold. It was very successful, but it was seen as just this grindhouse film. He didn't even, put a stamp on it properly, so the copyright fell out from his hands very quickly, which is a shame, which is why there are many different versions, and you have to watch the one you get. I would watch the one on Criterion, the Criterion Collection version. Then come the 70s. The 70s, like I said, it takes a while to start, but you at first you get these weird films. You get Black Christmas, which was like a proto-slasher, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Now it's the 70s. And you get so many films in the 70s. I'm not going to try to list a bunch of them. But at a certain point, something in the 70s changes. And that's around 1978. The movie Halloween comes out. The next year, Alien comes out. I think, 79. Alien comes out. Somewhere between those two, everything had changed. Then came Friday the 13th, which was directly imitating Halloween. And essentially, the 80s in horror had already started. And oddly enough, I would put Stanley Kubrick's The Shining as a 70s film. Because these things don't, just because you tip over a date doesn't make it an 80s film. And by the way, is 1980 part of the 80s? Well, we agree that it is, but it certainly makes an odd mathematical set. Then comes the 80s, and the 80s starts off with these slasher films, which are not nearly as serious as the horror of the 70s. Real 70s films, like The Exorcist, are going for your throat, and to rip it out. That's a 70s film. Whereas in the 80s, there was less of that, and more of, essentially, you could see it, if you use Robin Wood's terms, in the 70s, David Cronenberg's films, or Tobe Hooper, or John Carpenter, they were challenging the mainstream perspective, which is why he came up with this idea of horror films as revolution. But in the 80s, they're no longer challenging the mainstream. They are essentially to use, Virginia Wilson's term, a sub-zeitgeist. The mainstream zeitgeist is all the big hair and blockbuster movies and new wave music and stuff, but the sub-zeitgeist is horror films. Everyone knows they're there. We're going to Friday the 13th, Part 6. We're going to see Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Pretty good film. But these films aren't challenging anything, and there's a lot more cheesiness about them. And in fact, I would say that this era of the 80s films goes on all the way until the mid to late 90s, and finally ends with the movie Scream. Now, you do have films that are different than that. So, Silence of the Lambs in 1992 is very different from these cheesy kind of films, which is one reason I think why a lot of people challenge whether it's even a horror film, because it doesn't follow any of the tropes that had developed in the 80s. And that's actually, when people talk about that's not a horror film, they mean the tropes from the 80s more than anything. But also, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, Begotten. If you know, you know. Seven is a horror film. It can also be seen as a detective thriller. You know, and what in the world is a thriller? I've talked about this before. It has much less definition than a horror film. But then we come to 1996 and Scream comes along, and you start getting I would say there's a pause of about 5 years for meta horror, so that you start getting postmodern horror that refers to all the other horror films from the 80s. So it's critiquing that whole period that starts in the late 70s and goes on and creaks on until the 1990s. So the 90s, by the way, a lot of people will say it's a great time. Yeah, there are great movies there, but to me, the 21st century in total blows away the 80s and the 90s. And you can disagree with that. Feel free to do so. This postmodern pause period is when J-horror, Japanese horror, kind of came into the picture. And these two kind of came together. But the 21st century came along, and I look at basically everything from the 21st century, which kind of starts in 1999 with films like Audition, as going through to the present as being one period. A lot of people say, "Oh, I like the films from the teens a lot better than the films from the aughts," and I'm sitting there going, like, I see it all as the same. I just see different phases. So the first phase is extreme gore and remakes, and remakes goes on and on and on. We're still getting remakes, but remakes really got started then with one of the earliest ones. So 2003, actually, I think, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that is the first remake. It was very successful. I was talking to a younger Georgian guy earlier this week. He said he really liked the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I said, "Which one did you see?" And I started to describe it, and I realized, oh, you didn't see the original. But this extreme gore, which sometimes gets called torture porn, which I hate that name, but just so you know what I'm talking about, this extreme gore goes on and on and on. It really hasn't stopped. That's why I say this is all one period. So if you go to something like, the Terrifier movies, or if you go to the most recent Evil Dead, or if you go to see something like The Substance, you're still looking at extreme gore. It's just packaged very, very differently. Then you have a period which starts around 2010. By the way, my favorite horror film for the whole 21st century thus far is Martyrs, which is from 2008. And it is considered here's another subgenre within this, the new French extremity films, which are some of the darkest films ever. But it's also considered, some people consider it an extreme gore film, and it is extreme. I consider it one of the most philosophical films I've ever seen. And I think it's amazing. And if you've got the stomach for it, there are some films like Heretic or Companion, Strange Darling. I think a person who doesn't watch a lot of horror films could go watch those and get something out of it. Whereas Terrifier or Martyrs, you have to watch horror films first. You have to not be shocked by what you see. You have to be willing to take it in. And these films are trying to challenge you. So from 2010 till 2021, and again, why not 2020? Because it takes a couple of years for what happens in movies to catch up to being produced. So someone in Hollywood could say right now, we're going to make just great stories from now on. We wouldn't know much about it for 2 years. And we would say, see, here's another one, which is what we have been seeing. But this is a period of ghosts, demons, and this kind of clunky phrase called elevated horror. So films like The Babadook, The Witch, Hereditary, Midsommar, and such. But the interesting thing is, you get, I think the reason I chose 2010 is because that's when Insidious came out. And Insidious is one of the first of these new ghostly demon films. Yes, they use jump scares, but more it's the underlying it's the idea that there's something supernatural. Whereas in the extreme gore era, supernatural was not absent, but much further off the table for most of the films. We were dealing with human horror. Whereas then during this period of the teens, we'll call it, you have more of an emphasis on the supernatural or religious and things like that. Then we come to 2022 and beyond. And what's developed since then, I'm just going to call it the new dark golden age. Why the new dark? Well, I could call it the new dark age, but that could be where we're all living. And is it the golden age? No. I would say Universal Monsters still gets the golden age. Sobriquet? No. Escutcheon? No. Moniker? You get what I'm saying. But it is a period. I'm just going to read you a list of films since 2022 that I have found really worth watching and really saying something in all sorts of different ways. Now, you may hear one of these and go, ugh, well, that's you. That's fine. But I've read great reviews on all of these films from one source or another, and I think all of these are worth spending time with. So let me just read the list. Most recently, we had Obsession and Backrooms, both made by YouTubers. Both films, Obsession was made for $750,000 and has grossed very close to $500 million now. I haven't checked to see where it's gone over it yet, but it could have. That's an incredible return on investment. And it was made for next to nothing in film terms. Backrooms was made for closer to $10 million and has pulled in over $350 million in the last time I looked, and it could have pulled in more by then. So, and everyone is saying, what happened? Why has horror beat up the blockbusters? And we'll talk a bit more about this after I read the list. So, Obsession, Backrooms. Isn't that the Britney Spears movie? Backrooms, Evil Dead Rise, Evil Dead Burn, Heretic, The Substance, Terrifier. It was a trilogy of those, but the last two were the most important. Bring Her Back, Talk to Me, Companion, Megan, The X Trilogy, Barbarian, Weapons, Sinners, Oddity, Nosferatu, the Robert Eggers version, Late Night with the Devil, When Evil Lurks, Abigail, Longlegs, Strange Darling, The First Omen, Immaculate, The Final Destination, Bloodlines, The Ugly Stepsister, 28 Years Later in 2 parts, Iron Lung, Send Help, Hokum, and The Long Walk. And coming up later this year, here are some films I'm really looking forward to. Other Mommy. I've been watching previews of this. What in the heck's going on here? Werewolf. Robert Eggers has gone from vampires now to take on the werewolf story, and the imagery looks incredibly intense. Hope, a Korean film, and I don't know what the heck's going on with that. Is this aliens or monsters? I don't know. Resident Evil. Now, we've had a lot of middling Resident Evil movies, but this one's done by Zach Kreger, who did Weapons and Barbarian. And I've already seen the previews for this, and they look like his style. So I'm going like, okay, I'm in. And here are 2 very strange ones. Eli Roth's new movies, Ice Cream Man, which sounds like, really? And the last one is called, another film called Buddy. The interesting thing about these last 2 films is both of them take things that are kind of cute and turn them into horror. Buddy is about, I can't even describe it. It's like plush monsters, plushy type monsters, big furry, cuddly looking things. I'm ready because I've been seeing the darkness in the cute. Cute has been like a poison infesting our world. So it's only appropriate that the horror world is going to see this before the idiots who make real movies. And here's the thing. Most of these movies are independent films made with pretty low budgets. I mean, there's a few big budget films here, but most of them are small budgets. And And if you know anything about these films, they aren't all even vaguely the same. This is what makes this such an interesting period, this new dark golden age, is that it is, what can I say? It is not all one kind of film. There are so many different themes being carried because we live now in a time of total uncertainty in a way that probably hasn't existed in history. And I'm talking globally. Nobody anywhere can predict how this year will end. Will we be fighting in Iran? Will Ukraine and Russia still be fighting? Will Europe implode because of immigration? What's happening with the environment? What's happening with politics? How many different wars are going on right now in Africa? We're living in very strange, unpredictable times. Ever since the pandemic, we haven't come out of this period of uncertainty yet. There's no global certainty anywhere. And we're seeing things we've never seen before. So, we are losing our sense also of physical reality. And that's because we're spending too much time online, watching too much. And hey, I'm there with you, you're watching this with me. This is something we really have to think about. Let's see. And so we have a lot of films with weird objects, like the mannequin in the movie Oddity, stop motion, these very strange stop motion puppets. And so we see puppets and dolls and clowns. How did clowns go from being the thing that made you laugh to the thing you're afraid of? And after watching the Terrifier movies with Art the Clown, I just finally conceded, okay, clowns are from the devil. They are now. They used to not be. When I was a kid, you'd find no one who was afraid of clowns, Stephen King notwithstanding.
I have to go back to the Terrifier.
It's still buried there, isn't it?
It might be the only thing that can stop them.
Then we have our fears of AI taking over. So we have films like Megan and this one coming up. There was that movie Her that came out, more of a science fiction film with Joaquin Phoenix. Then we have this one Soulmate coming up. But there are more where we're afraid.
Hello?
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 Wow, Josh.
And in fact, if you think about a movie like Obsession, the relationship of the girl to the guy almost feels like an AI relationship, in the sense that it's someone who doesn't understand the nature.
I love you so much. A love only the branch of a willow tree could conjure.
It's weird how you two are dating all of a sudden. Like, super dating.
This guy makes a wish. His wish comes true. He wants his girlfriend to love him. But her responses are totally not anything to do with love. He should have specified what love means. But, of course, he didn't know. But in AI relationships, I've heard terrifying things of AI just casually suggesting that people off themselves. of them saying, essentially we have AI cults and such now. We're going to see a lot more AI horror films. And virtual relationships. Since so many of our relationships have ceased taking place in the physical, anything to do with the physical is a source of fear for us, as is our computer. Both places have become loci of fear. And then that brings us to liminal horror. We have created a dystopian world of empty buildings, empty hospital spaces. I can guarantee you they're here in Georgia. I experienced it. We're in, apartment buildings, shopping malls, new buildings in general are terrifyingly bad and empty. And especially once the people clear out, then the liminality, this between this and that space comes out.
Clark.
You found it.
Why are you hiding?
You're being too loud.
Where are we?
It's every place that ever was.
How long have you been here? What was that?
Stay calm. It's only me. You know me.
And Backrooms really deals with that. It has to do with the horror of architecture, the real thing we've created to get rid of the beauty of the past. Because that was just for the elites, whereas now this is made by the elites for the plebs. And then there are we're still living in a time of really bloody films. So Art the Clown, the Evil Dead movies, and some of these others here. And some really shocking films. I was just looking at the title, Late Night with the Devil. Some of these others just have, and demon films still here. When Evil Lurks, one of the most dark films about evil I've ever seen, and demons. And it's from Argentina. So we have bloody films. We are in a time of war. And so we still have that seeping into our films. But in a way very differently from World War II. And, if in World War II, there was hardly any horror films. Very interesting. During the Vietnam War is when you get the rise of the new, very exploitative, bloody film. Now, since September 11th in 2001, we have seen the rise of very bloody films because we've essentially been, it's like the Middle East has been the boogeyman the whole time. They haven't stopped. There's a hope within me that if the Iran situation stops and is settled and the people in Iran can breathe freely again, maybe this will stop the insanity of Muslim extremism. Not immediately, of course, but over time. Meanwhile, evil runs rampant. We have grief films, like Bring Her Back is a grief film. There are many of these other films here are grief films as well. Films that essentially are about losing someone. Megan is a grief film. Girl loses her family, and she's given an AI robot. an android to take its place. And then, like I said, Ice Cream Man and Buddy look to be the beginning of cute horror films. And I'm all for that, because I think cute needs to be put in its place. It has taken over the minds of far too many people without them knowing it. And you can look up some of the work I've done on cuteness. So, I'm getting tired of talking, and I hope you understand what I'm saying. The reason horror is there is because horror is the only genre dealing with where we really are. Comedies don't know how to. Maybe we'll get more war films down the road. Last year's Warfare was excellent. So much drama is infused with still these ideas from the last decade of the DEI stuff. But I think that we are about to arrive in a new place. Gary from Nerdrotic, Gary Buechler, who has a book out I recommend, a book of his life story from prison to YouTube, essentially. He says the fact that there are these great independent horror films being made and getting people to sit in the theaters, putting the butts in the seats, is a great sign. But until other genres can also be resurrected, it won't be a sign of a real change in movies. I take a slightly different approach. My approach is this. He's right, I think, but we are in a different place. The horror film has been what stand-up comedy has been on YouTube and in live, is the place where things can be challenged. And that's not to say all of these are based or woke or whatever. No, there's a lot of different viewpoints in all these films. But that is the point. We are talking to each other about each other's fears. That is where we are. And I think we should celebrate that. That we have some way of discussing it openly. And so what's interesting is horror films have gone from the sub-basement. They have crawled all the way up from the sub-zeitgeist, and now they are the zeitgeist. This is Byrne in Tbilisi, Georgia, saying thank you for listening. If you want to support the channel, you can do so through PayPal. If you don't want to use PayPal, there's a GoFundMe link that's still active from many years ago. You can also join my Patreon. And you can, let's see, what else? Well, just support the channel. Thanks. Subscribe. Like it. Do what you can. If you think this was interesting, pass it around. Anyway, from Tbilisi, Georgia, where the word droibit means we will indeed meet again. This is Byrne in Georgia saying droibit.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you, boys, I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise from death in numberless infinities of souls.
Isn't this place just endless?
A podej mi sem tu živou!
Spas duši Kriste Ježíši, smiluj se v nouzi nejvyšší. Ty mrtví nevstávej a lež. Pán Bůh tě potěš a mne též.